October
I had
25th.
two M's and
Meeting of
two
the
L's.
Houston County Historical Society. I was at a historical society last night, another meeting, a much larger county, and they had 17 people. So I thank you all for your support and coming to Houston County. We have a good program tonight, so thank you all. Stead, would you lead us in the pledge to flag and stand?
I will, to most people's light, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We also have a sign sheet going around. If you don't get to it, just please try to get to it before the night is over. Those of you who are members, did you get the minutes from the meeting last month? If there's any problem, let me know. If any questions or corrections of those minutes? If not, we will stand approved for those minutes. Treasurer's report, Leah, please.
We had we had income of $525 last month, expenses of $290. So the balance in our money market is $3,030.66. Our CD got some quarterly interest, so there's just over $11,400 in our CD. From our cemetery map project, we still have $125 to cover as far as the cost. I believe there are still some maps to be sold somewhere.
Yeah, we've still got some maps for sale and also the books.
So,
Do you have the where?
Yes,
in our artifacts account, we have a balance of $76.21. I believe Melissa's gonna tell us about something she acquired. And I know that they're still working, or there's something to do with the brick account. We have almost $625 remaining allocated to the brick project at the Investigating Park.
And we plan to turn that over to the city of Erie. And Vanetta lets us know
Yes.
officially what we need to do with that.
I can get in touch with her and ask her about that. But that money is allocated in our account.
Is there any questions or comments or corrections on the treasurer's report? If not, we will deem those approved. Old business. We have prints. I don't know if you saw it in the minutes or not. Melissa's going to tell you about the prints that Miss Alice Miles had, and we will have those for sale. Melissa will let you know about those. World War II, Jackie, will you let us know about what's going on with that?
We recently met with the principal of the high school, Dr. Rutherford, and he has given us tentative approval to have our World War II program on August the 19th, 2023, which is a Saturday afternoon. We also met with head of the history department who's with us here tonight, Miss Emily Moore, and she has one of her students with her, and she's going to be helping us with that project. She's going to be having her students interview their family members about what their great-grandparents were doing during the World War, and she's going to share that information with us, and we're going to be able to add that to our program. And we hope to help her as well, because if students have problems finding information about a family member, we have lots of individuals who'd be more than glad to help. So. And Melissa had very good results from her article in the Herald about our World War II project. Ms. Judy Fazell is with us also tonight, and also Barbara Sykes has already donated some newspaper clippings from the World War II era, so we're very happy to have those. And Clint Reynolds brought a photograph of Mr. James Rockus who was a World War II veteran, so we're already getting in things. So what I need from our members tonight is a little money. I'm asking for $300 worth of seed money to pay for the processing and printing and display of the materials that we receive. So I'd like to make a motion that the society approve up to $300 for our project.
Second.
All approved? Aye. Any objections? Thank you. Donald, if you'll update us on the cemetery maps and.
Oh, okay. As far as the cemetery project, we're about ready whenever they get their webpage up to put it digital. We're working with Leah, updating the veterans and make sure we've got all the veterans listed in the cemetery book, and then it'll be ready to go on. And I guess Melissa could put it up on Jim Webb, but whenever they get their Facebook, their webpage up, they can put it on that. It'll all be digital. We've got some more maps over here still in the cemetery books from 2003. They're for sale, and if we run out, we can get some more. So, and I guess that's about it.
Thank you. The meeting in November will be at the archives. Melissa will tell you more about that in a moment. Usually when we have food, we meet at 6 o'clock instead of 7, so we will eat at 6. Paper products and punch will be provided. If you'll bring finger foods, we will meet at 6 o'clock at the archives in the courthouse on the date. It's November. It's the third Tuesday. We had a conflict with the second Tuesday being the election, so we have scooted that meeting to the third Tuesday. Ms. Ann wanted to make an announcement.
Yes, I'm glad I thought of this. Houston County Arts Council is sponsoring a jazz concert. This group of people from Clarksville were here last year, or part of this group, and they had their performance up at the Presbyterian Church. Well, it was so well received, we're moving to the high school. And it's October the 27th at 7:30, and you know, Arts Council things are free. We do accept donations, but I think a lot of you all in this group would enjoy that. The poster's over there if you want to check it before you leave. Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Are there any other announcements anyone would like to say? Anything? Excuse me. All of our new business, I think, has gone to old business now. If there's any new business anybody knows of, then we will discuss that now. Otherwise, I'll let Melissa introduce our speaker and tell us what's going on in the archives.
Wow, get up here and see all the people. My name is Melissa Barber. I'm the archivist at the Houston County Archives and Museum, which is located in the basement of the courthouse. If you haven't come to see us, please do. We have a lot of exhibits and displays of Houston County history. First, let's talk about the prints. These prints, Benetta James actually found these at her home, and they belong to the Historical Society, so we're selling them. They used to be sold to the Historical Society. They're Alice Miles prints. This one is of the courthouse. These are numbered, and these are $50. There are approximately 19 of those here, and once these are sold, that's it. That's all that we have, unless someone has another cache somewhere. The other one is 88 Steps to Knowledge. We have 2 of these left. Because of how they were stored, there's a little boxing around the edge. These are not numbered. These are $25 each. And whoever gets the 2, that's all we have. So after the speaker, if you want to purchase these, I'll be up here to take your money. The meeting in November is November 15th. I looked it up. It's 6 p.m. because we're having food. We usually meet at 6. So bring finger foods that night to the archives, and we'll have that, and I'll be talking about archives and why they matter. And then last month as we met, I wanted to talk about some wonderful donations that we received at the archives. Many of you probably saw it in the newspaper. We got a wonderful donation of a spinning wheel. Actually, it's on loan from the Brown family. I mean, he's pretty much donated it, but he said just in case his children or his grandchildren want it back, it's kind of on loan, unless they don't want it, and then it stays. So it's kind of like that. So please come by and see it. It is absolutely a wonderful piece of local history. Some other things that we have received has come from the Hankins family. We received this house. And I did not bring it because it's large and it probably would break. It's a very large ship. And both of these items were made out of matchsticks. And when I say this name, y'all are probably going to go, oh, I know who that is, because I had several people tell me they knew him. His name is William Rabbit Hankins. He went by Rabbit Hankins. Anybody know him? Remember him? Oh, okay. Well, anybody that I mentioned his name to, they said, oh, he's such a nice guy. But what is interesting about these two pieces is that he made them while he was in prison in Nashville. So there is such a thing as prison art. If anybody's in the art world, there is such a thing as prison art. When you look at this house and you're welcome to pick it up, he has carpet and he has wallpaper in the house. And when we come by the archives, the ship that he made is a big ship. I mean, this thing is probably this big with masts and everything. So it's wonderful. They also donated, Jarrett Hankins donated this photograph of their ancestor. This is Mr. John Hankins. He was born in 1860 and died in 1920. So we are always wanting photographs to document our history of Houston County. The next thing that I have is not a donation from an individual, but one of the other things that people don't think about our archives is that we're county archives. Our first and foremost job is to take care of, organize, and archive the county records. As many of you know, Ms. Cheryl Moore, our Registrar of Deeds, passed away. So in cleaning out some of the offices and some of the filing cabinets and trying to make room for more records, the staff there has sit down some very old books. This one is one of 3 volumes that they sit down, and this is for lack of a better term, it's a ledger book where they kept up with payments of who paid for a particular instrument that was filed. This is volume 1. This one starts 1871. And so it was kept for actually keeping up with the dollar amounts of what people paid. But when you look through here, they filed a deed or they had a mortgage. And in the later volumes, volume 2, volume 3, it's where veterans filed their discharge papers. And you'll see it says honorably discharged or U.S. Air Force or something like that. So these are very valuable records to have. We have the deed records, but I just think that these are really special too. So you're welcome to look at that. And then our eBay purchase that Leah talked about came to us all the way from West Virginia, Berkeley, West Virginia. I found this token, it's a store token, and it's J.G. Collier. Dates to the late 1800s. I don't know where people find this stuff, probably in estate sales or whatever, but I scour eBay looking for these things to bring them back home to us. And so I'll pass it around. It's a 25-cent token, and does anybody know or have ever read about the company store and how that used to work? You worked for the company, you got paid in company store money. The catch was you could only spend it in the company store. Who was making out on that one? So I'm going to pass that around. Let's see if I got everything. Last but not least, one of the things that we are doing is due to some grant money that we received last year, we purchased digitization equipment, scanners, and things like that. And the project that we had proposed to get that money was to digitize a large collection of photo slides that the UT Extension Office had given to us. These are photo slides that date from the 1970s to 1980s, 90s. And they include such things as 4-H events, beef shows, home demonstration photos. The home demonstration photographs have been amazing to look at. So we are finally are in the process of digitizing these. My problem is, I don't know who anybody in the photographs are, and it's difficult to put names on photo slides. And so if there is anyone here that would like to come spend some time at the archives, I could set you up on the Patriot computer and you could look through these photographs to your heart's content and help us identify who these people are. I've sent a few over to Angie Nielsen at City Hall, and she's been kind of passing them around to the girls there and to some of the people. They've been able to identify some, which has been fantastic. My dream was to identify everybody. Today we scanned some photographs of a dairy, what do they call it, a June dairy promotion event that took place in the square. And in one of the photographs you can see the old telephone booth. You can see Western Auto in the background. So it's not just the event or the people in the event, but I look past that to what's in the background. Did they capture a store? Did they capture historical something that we don't have anymore? You would not believe how many people remember the phone booth. And I posted the photo one time of that. And the stories. And also one of these photos, was there not a bench there that had what they used to say, the men would sit there and talk, the whittler's bench. Well, that same photograph, you can see the photo booth and then the bench is sitting on the bench. And this dates from, actually, they were 1985, actually. I didn't realize the phone booth was there. Doesn't seem that long ago to me. So if you would really like to help the archives, come by and help us identify some photographs. And that's what I would got. Oh, yeah. I should add too, this goes without saying, the archives is always ready to accept donations of records, photographs, artifacts, anything having to do with Houston County or anyone who lived here. We are getting lots and lots of visitors once we put our sign up. I have people that are moving into here to see our sign and then come in. And then we have people that live here forever and say, I didn't know we had a museum. I said, well, it's been here for about 10 years, but we've just now been able to afford a sign. So we're having a lot of visitors now come in. So if you have anything to donate, I would encourage you to bring it because we put it on display and people are looking at it. And yes.
Explain that term, donate and loan.
When you donate something, you give it to the archives, but it becomes the property of the Houston County Archives and Museum. If you want to put something on loan, which we have several pieces like that at the archives, we have you sign a document, which helps both of us, whoever is doing it, telling us we are putting this on loan, if for any reason whatsoever in the future we want to come get it back, we have to hand it back to you.
Thank you.
And if you have documents and photographs or artifacts that you're not ready to let go of, you can still bring it to the archives. We have digitization equipment, and we would love to get copies of it so that at least we have that. And then we'll digitize it and hand it right back to you, and you can walk out the door with it. And now I'm going to introduce Miss Suzy Askew. She's probably going to tell us more about herself because all I know is that Suzy Askew is an awesome person. And they live in a wonderful cabin down on White Oak. So I'm going to leave it up to her to tell us the story of White Oak, and I think it probably should include some of our family. So, and I'm going to pass around this token.
My name is Suzanne Irwin Askew. And this presentation will sort of tell you everything about the Irwins and the Askews. Andrew Lytle, a Vanderbilt agrarian in the early 20th century, said, if you really want to know yourself, you need to know your ancestors. And I have a theory that besides inheriting blue eyes or brown hair, we inherit personality and the quirkiness of our forefathers. I have a, is this being recorded? Yes. Okay, well then I won't say that. Okay,
Go ahead.
I have a sister that's mean, and I say it's mother's side Aunt Olive and daddy's side Aunt Lorraine. It's a combination of those genes. So this is tracing my immediate history. These are my Askew grandparents. He died when I was born. He was 93. She died in 1937, so I never knew her. She was a Tomlinson's from Lower White Oak Creek. These are my Irwin grandparents, Bill and Clevie, A.G., all four Houston Countyans. And they produced these two, my very happy father Otis and mother Frances, and they raised the four girls in Corinth, Mississippi. So that's the short version. Here's the mean one. So my early memories of any place in the world besides Corinth were of Houston County. I was born in 1952, and every occasion, all holidays, and any emergency, we came to Houston County. Now it's a 3-hour drive, but that was before Interstate 40. Back then it was about a 5-hour drive, and I was the one that got car sick. So we would come up here to visit both sides of the family, and in that day and time, there was an obligation to do so, and you were here to help. So we came with a carload of food. Our suitcases were packed by outfits, and we were allowed one a day, and as soon as we got here, we were let go to roam the countryside until it was time to eat. They didn't seem to be worried about anything concerning danger. We avoided it most of our lives. So we would go to the Irwins on Lewis Branch to see my mother's parents and relatives, and we'd go down to White Oak Creek, Lower White Oak Creek on Old John Boat Dock Road to go to Aunt Lillian's cabin. And that cabin is now Suzy's cabin. But I'll tell you more about that later. Next slide. I think influences in any county have to do with a lot of things, and I have to bring up that my part of my family was Methodist and part was Cumberland Presbyterian. And within the same marriage, one would go to one church and one the other. My Aunt Irene bridged both groups by having both meetings in the same church, and she ran it all. But Clovis Chapel was a great influence in my life. He's from Waverly, and he was a theologian, and he came to Corinth to do revivals, and Mother always had him out for dinner. He was a little tiny man. Does anybody know Clovis Chapel? Yes. Great books, and my mother thought he was just a wonderful, wonderful man. And so whenever we went through Waverly to get here, we would stop to see Cousin Oliver Tomlinson, and also Mother would remind us it was the hometown of Clovis Chapel, who had been there for the revival 3 weeks ago. So we knew a lot about Clovis. Next slide. So on Daddy's side of the family, here he is behind the American flag. What a pensive look on his face. Here he is with a nephew. He loved children, he loved dogs. And here is his father riding the horse with those same two nephews behind him. And here is his older brother, Charles Dashler Askew, standing on a mule in a tie. That's the Askews. They lived on Lower White Oak Creek. Their house was part of the floodplain for the Tennessee River, so it was taken apart and moved to Nashville. The steps are still there, and it's mostly wetland. Next slide. So I've always been interested in maps. I was the one that helped the map and told my mother how to get somewhere. Once she and I came up here to get her mother and take her back to Corinth, she was elderly, and we got lost. Mother had no sense of direction. We were riding all over the county, and we stopped. There was an old man on the front porch of the house, and Mother said, "We're just going to have to ask." So this man hobbled out to the car and said, "Clevie Askew, I haven't seen you in 75 years. And my grandmother said, "Well, so-and-so, how you doing?" And she said, "We're lost. How do we get to Waverly?" And he told us. So after that, I realized I needed to keep up with where we were going and how to get there, which is the map. So you see the circle down there. This orients us all. This is the Askew Cemetery. And for my childhood, it was never used because the Askews don't die. Or at least for 90 to 100 years. So it was just a place we visited, and we cleaned the graves, and Uncle Dashler replanted it every once in a while. But right down from that Askew Cemetery, on the next little road, there was a log cabin that my Aunt Lillian had purchased from her grandmother's side of the family, the Brighams. And so this Askew property, before that was the Brigham property, which was her grandmother. And of course, this map you notice is before the flood, because the creek runs through it. My earliest childhood memory was going, next slide. Oh, sorry, here's the title. So I'm going to take you down White Oak Creek with maps, memories, and landmarks. And some of these things I've just recently discovered, some I've known my whole life. But I always go back to the cemeteries to orient myself to who my people are and how they live. Next slide. So education was very important in my family. The Irwins were all smart. There were 11 children, but they were very poor. And both my grandparents had passed high school education, but with 11 children and farming, they never had much. My grandmother was the one that saved the money and helped her children go to school and insisted they go to school. And most of the children were really, really smart. There's my mother peeking out behind. I think in every photograph I have of her, she's peeking out behind. I put a star on every one of the people that I'm kin to. So the school was made up mostly of Irwins and Cooks. And I'll explain that soon. Okay, next slide. So here's my mother's high school graduation. She was valedictorian of her senior class. She graduated at 16, and she got a scholarship for 1 year to Bethel College in McKenzie, and she got her lifetime teaching certificate. By the time she got to Mississippi, Mississippi wouldn't accept it, so she had to go back to school and get a 4-year degree. And she started that when I was in 2nd grade. So at one time she could name all these people, and she was, it was a close class. Next slide. So my early memory of going to this place, I never knew it was my grandparent Tom Linson's family home. I never knew it was a log cabin. When I went there, Aunt Irene, Mother's oldest sister, had married Uncle Sid, Daddy's cousin, and I don't know how. Here they are together, Daddy and Sid. And they lived there with Sid's bachelor brother, W.B. Summers. And it was, later I discovered it was the Tomlinson place where my grandmother, Julia Ida Tomlinson, was born and grew up. And this was the doctor's office that was her uncle's doctor's office. It is also a log cabin. There's a little door back here to a vault that you can go in and see the original logs. So after a few years, an old bachelor named Mr. Wilson gave Sid and Irene his land that's up closer to Cooley Ford, and they moved. Aunt Irene was the matriarch of the family. She ran the Methodist and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. She taught school for 53 years, and she told all her 10 brothers and sisters what to do, and they did it. I loved her. She was like my grandmother, because my grandmother was quite elderly when I was young. Next slide. So here you see the beginning of my map. So Ligon's cabin became mine. Here's the cemetery. Down here where it's flooded was the Askew property. Strangely enough, over here on Douglas Bluff, when the road used to go all the way around, my grandmother Irwin's sister, Aunt Lily Parker, had a house there. And Mother recalls going down as a child to the Douglas Bluff to stay with Aunt Lily, and it was a grand house with a nice porch. Aunt Lillian's cabin, we think is about 1835. They never lived in it except for the summers. As soon as May hit, Aunt Lillian would either arrive from St. Louis, Missouri while Tom was working, or Sun City, Arizona when they retired, and she'd spend the whole summer up there. When she died in 1997, I wrote my cousin, Annette, and said, what are you gonna do with it? Would you sell it to me? And she said, I have it on the market and I will sell it to you. She never liked it. She called it Protestant purgatory. Because when she got there, she had to clean it out, and the mice and the bats and all that. And it didn't have heat and air, and the bathroom was in a little tiny closet, so she couldn't stand it. She couldn't wait to get rid of it. She's since been back and has changed the name. So she likes what I did with it. Next slide. So the Askew's farm was called Maple View. Here you see images of my grandfather, and this is my Aunt Louise, and Louise married Ed Rauscher, and this is their son, Ed Rauscher. The picket fence plays a prime role in this house. It's in a lot of the images. I'm like Melissa, I picked up on little details like that. And also horses and mules. I've asked, when my parents were alive, I asked them their impressions of different people, and I asked my mother what she thought of her father-in-law, and she said he was the cleanest-minded man I've ever been around, but he was grumpy. And he and your daddy didn't get along, and when he got really old, I'd press Mr. Askew's pants and send your daddy in with him, and Papa would say, those aren't my pants, I'm not putting them on. And they'd get in a huge fight, so Daddy'd come out just blazing mad and goes, give me the pants. She'd walk in there and say, Mr. Askew, here are your pants. And he'd say, I thought you'd find them. He also would, my mean sister would hide his walking cane, and he'd pay her a nickel to find it. So she made money on it. Next slide. So these are beautiful portraits of the children. This is my daddy in a dress, and his next older sister, Lillian, and then the three oldest children, Lorraine, Dashler, and Louise. And this is my grandmother, and then here my papa is as he aged. Notice my grandfather was born in the Civil War. The Askews married late. I think he was in his 30s when he married Julia Ida Tomlinson. My daddy was 48 when he married my mother. So we barely get a generation, 2 generations in a century. It's amazing. Next slide. What I know about my grandmother is in paper ephemera. She died so young. You can see she was born in 1870, married my grandfather in 1894, and died in 1937. This is something that Daddy kept in that old Askew desk he had, a herbarium sheet where you press native plant specimens and record where you found them, when you found them. And she did this when she was at the Edgeworth Normal School. And I always thought that was amazing that it would last that long over those many years. Next slide. She also, I ended up with a crazy quilt she made, and she embroidered the hands of her 2 oldest children on this quilt, and when she started the quilt, and their initials. And I ended up giving this to Uncle Dashler's granddaughter when she married, and it's now residing in Norway. But she really appreciated having something from a great-grandmother. Next slide. So this is a sad thing. Their first child was named Lucille Askew. And she lived to be 3.5 years old, and she died. And after she died, the other children were born. But in my possession is a letter she wrote the day she died with a curl of her hair. And this says, my darling's curl, our darling's curl. And this is the sympathy note they sent out to people that acknowledged the death. Next slide. So to translate this, it says, a curl from the head of my own little sweet darling Lucille Askew. It was cut from her head on the day of her death, December 7th, 1899. She was 3 years, 6 months, and 5 days old. God giveth, and God taketh away. God knows best, and we must submit. but oh, how hard to bear, and she underlined that. But by and by, we will go to meet her. It was hard to part, but oh, how sweet it will be to meet. And she signed it, her mother, Ida Askew. Next slide. So what's so, and this, they took of the dead child. She's not sleeping, she's passed. And what's so interesting, my whole childhood, her brothers and sisters talked about her as if they knew her, and they would tear up. So the mother and father, kept her memory alive to them as if they had actually known her. And I was always amazed, and I think that may be where we get our empathy in our family. We understand that grief, even though we weren't a part of it. Next slide. So here they are, the 6 siblings after Lucille. My father, Leah, with the cabin. The oldest brother, Dashler. Aunt Louise, Rauscher, the English teacher. Aunt Nettie, the baby. And Aunt Lorraine. Julia favors Aunt Lorraine, my sister. A lot of the same characteristics. And they were very close. And they were so close, they vacationed together and didn't invite any of their children. Weird. Once Aunt Lorraine had to invite her son Charles Marable because she wanted to take all her money with her, and it was in coinage, and she couldn't lift the suitcases, but she didn't tell him, but she had him come and take her to the gathering. It was in Arkansas. And he said he got a hernia the first grab of that luggage. It was so full of coins that she wouldn't leave it behind. And of course, if you know Aunt Lorraine, she was married to Charlie Marable, and they lived here their whole lives. Next slide. So that gets us from here to here. And what is that? That is Lewis Branch. But there's also Erin. So Lower White Oak Creek, Lewis Branch, and Erin. So we made this circuit all the time. Next slide. So I was asking my friend Janine Larkin Horn tonight, when did you walk into the Lichterman? And she said 2009. So I'm working at Lichterman Nature Center in Memphis, propagating native plants. And a group of people come in to get their master gardener hours. And so I have everything set out, and they're potting up plants and separating seeds and making labels on and all that. And we were discussing our weekend plans, and somebody asked me, and I said, well, I'm going to a place you've never heard of. There's no use me mentioning it. And this beautiful redheaded woman said, oh, where's that? And I said, well, White Oak Creek in Houston County. And she said, I graduated from Houston County High School. And I said, shut your mouth. You did not. She said, yeah. So it was like we were sisters from another mother. We've been friends ever since. And we talked so much about Houston County, we decided we both had to meet up there and drive from one end to the other to see what the relationship was with where we grew up and where we lived. And that's why I did the map. Because I'd heard my parents talk about Pollard Branch, and they're over on Pennywinkle, and he's down at Frank Branch, and it was all scrambled, and I wanted to unscramble it. So my husband, Larry Raines, ordered the 3 county maps for me. I'm trained as a landscape architect, so I overlaid them on a light table and just traced the creeks and ignored everything else, and this is what I came up with. I was also very interested in where the water came from and how clean it was. And so I did a stream order, and that is right here. So when a stream begins from a spring, it's a primary order stream. So it's got just dots. When it meets another primary order stream and they join, it's secondary. When a secondary meets another one, it's tertiary, and it goes on down. And as you can see, by the time it gets to Lower White Oak Creek, it's just an amalgamation of this whole watershed. And that's how I decided to organize it. I also made a listing of all the creeks and branches that run into it on the north side and on the south side. And I didn't want the roads to be important, I wanted them to be minor so I could really see the creeks. The only important road was Highway 13. Next slide. So the key is, this is a symbol of a bridge, an X with a red dot in it. The dots and dashes are the creeks and branches. Dark line, Highway 13, roads, just a very thin line. Next slide. So, and here is the primary order bridge, primary order stream. So if it's from the spring, it looks like this. Where 2 join, it changes. Where 3 join, it changes again. So it's a matter of dots and dashes. Okay, next slide. Here are the ones on the south side of the stream. And a lot of these you will identify. And a lot of you probably may either live on these or are very familiar with them. I'm not that familiar with that many of them on the south side. But boy, my people talked about them. Brister Branch, and oh, he's over on Alls Creek, and that was just their reference for all this. Next slide.
Sorry, I'm paying attention.
I'm more familiar with the north side of the creek, and that's because we always travel on the north side. So here we go. The first creek that I was familiar with was Kurt Branch, and that's because Aunt Irene's first house was the old Tomlinson place on Kurt Branch. I even remember, and some of you might, walking out in that field toward the White Oak Creek, and there was a little boat dock out there, and somebody sold bait, and you could fish from there, and you could bring your boat up, but it's since silted in, and all that's gone. Next slide. So here's the main road of White Oak Creek, and here's Kurt Branch that goes off to the north. And there's the sign. Next. I'm also very familiar with Hill Orchard Cemetery, and Larry insisted before we leave there that we unfurled the flag. Because we spent a lot of time in this cemetery. When I was in 3rd grade, my teacher, Mrs. Swan, called Mother and said, "Oh, we have a big problem with Suzy." And Mother said, "I'm like, what is it? What's wrong?" And she said, "She is lying." And Mother said, "Well, what's she saying?" She said that y'all go to a cemetery on Sundays and have picnics." And Mother said, "Well, that's true. We do that a lot. Memorial Day and Labor Day, we usually go to Hill Orchard." She said, "Really? Why would you do that?" Mother said, "It's just a tradition. We do that, but Suzy's fairly truthful." Miss Swan. She played bridge every afternoon. She couldn't care less about teaching. So next slide. So here is U.S. Tomlinson and Julia Ida Tomlinson in monuments. And so those are my people, and there are more of my people in there, I just don't know who, because I'm really interested in the women in the family. What was Julia Ida Tomlinson's mother's name, and she was a Holmes, I know that. But I need to make those names more transparent to me. Next slide. So this was a big deal. Daddy's not on the plaque, so I'm sure he was resentful. But Suzy Askew is the one that was standing next to him by the flag, the cousin. And can you imagine naming a child Looney at this day and time? And Dashler's his oldest brother, and here's a Holmes, which we probably kin to, and here's his sister, Lori Askew Marable. I'm kin to the McCaskills 2 or 3 different ways. So they formed a group and came up here and took care of this family cemetery. Next slide. If you go back one, I also have to throw in a few things like this fabulous deciduous holly tree in the middle of this cemetery. Now go to the next slide. And this is what it looks like. From my I love plants, and from my background in landscape design, I know plants pretty good, and I just really think that's a wonderful tree in the cemetery. So I have to drive by and see the tree as much as anything. Next slide. So there are landmarks of memory, but there are also visible signs. This is where the Bethlehem Methodist Church was moved to. And now there's a trailer there because the original church got burned. This is that wonderful little log cabin before you go down to the bridge. Janine, tell me who owns that.
Oh, I don't know who owns it now.
It was somebody,
Oh, someone that we went to school with,
Yeah.
yes.
And
Lived there at the time.
and I'm so glad they kept it up. It's a landmark to me. On the opposite hill is this community center that Anna Reed and Miss Pauline Traylor were instrumental in building and funding through their bake sales and such. And we've had several urban family reunions there. And then the sign at Magnolia is fantastic. Thank goodness that sign is there to recall what had been there before. Next slide. So a few years ago, I found my mother's old Christmas cards, and this is her cousin, Patty Haney Venerable. And I just took a chance and wrote her a letter at that address, and she was alive at 90 years old, and actually more fit than Larry and I. And so I said, I really would like for you to come back and stay with us, and we'll drive up to Houston County and explore. So she did that. We had a marvelous time, and she had great memories. So we went all over, and she's still alive in Colorado. But when I was going through a scrapbook that belonged to my Aunt Nettie, I found this image of the same church from the 1930s. And I was happy to see it chronicles that way. Next slide.
That's New Hope?
Mhm. Another plant that marks my passage in and out of the county is this one. The easiest name for it is Columbo. Are any of you familiar with Columbo?
Doesn't it only bloom every?
12 to 13 years? Yeah, it's a very odd plant. It grows really tall. It starts out as a little rosette, almost lettuce-like, and it gets 12 to 15 feet tall, and it grows in a colony of a bunch of them, and they select, and every year only a couple of them will bloom. But you'll see it in along the roadside and in abandoned fields, and it's a fantastic plant, great story, and quite rare. Next slide. So a lot of these plants I look up to see, and you see Houston County right there, and this shows every county it appears in Tennessee, and Houston County is one of the few where you can find it. So I usually look up the native plants to see what they're endemic to, and thrilled when I see it's Houston County, because then I look for it. Next slide. So Fraseria caroliniensis is commonly known as American Columbo or yellow jimson. It's a herbaceous perennial found in deciduous forests and throughout the east and southeast, and it had another name that they changed it. So that's Columbo. Next slide. Okay, so we're going up the creek and we get to New Hope. The AG home was where my cousin Danny Bishop lives now. There's a trailer. But as a young child, we went by there, and Mother would have Daddy stop and point to a beautiful little Gothic carpenter house that her grandfather had built. And it was adorable. It was like gingerbread, is what Mother called it. But, and I never knew the AG side of the family. I did know Danny, we're the same age. I knew his mother, Liddy Bell, and I met his grandmother, Evie, a few times. But they lived here, and then when you go back to the Lower White Oak Creek Road, you turn in before you get to the bridge and you go to Busby Cemetery. Next slide. So at the Busby Cemetery, Mother always said we were kin to the Busbys, but I never knew how. And here is Dave and Lucinda, that was Uncle Dave and Aunt Cindy that she talked about. And Uncle Dave was quite a character. He never really worked, he just visited from farm to farm and told stories. Another characteristic, don't you think? So he had 2 or 3 daughters in Memphis, and the train ran from there was a station at Tennessee Ridge, so he appeared to the station master one day. He was sending a pig, a carcass of a pig, to Memphis to his daughters. So somebody saw him and he was all mad, and they said, "What's wrong, Uncle Dave?" And he said, "Oh, the station master sent me over here to get a shroud for my old sow." He was trying to ship the pig with no covering, just a bare piece of pork. And so they made him go get some cheesecloth or something to wrap it up in so they wouldn't have to deal with a bare pig. That was Uncle Dave. The other thing was they evidently had a lot of children, and they asked Uncle Dave, "Well, we heard you just had a new child." "Yes, he did." And they said, "Well, what was it?" And he said, "I swear I forgot to look." So that was Uncle Dave. Next slide. So this is Joshua Hardesty Agee, my mother's grandfather, and his wife, Mary Elizabeth Young. And that's the Agee family tree. I knew Aunt Lily, my grandmother Clevie, and my Aunt Lizzie. And they were very old women when I knew them, but delightful. And Aunt Lizzie's daughter married the man, they had the grocery store at McKinnon, the Weaver grocery store, that was somehow in their family too. And I'm not quite sure how I'm related to Danny, but I think maybe his mother was an Agee and that was her daddy, but it gets complicated. Notice that she was 13 years old when they married. Next slide. And here is Joshua and Mary E's grave. And all this stuff you Google and find out all about him, which was wonderful. He fought in the Union Army. I always forget how to say that. I'm going to say for the Federals, but he fought in the Union Army, got a discharge, and drew a pension and settled in this county. Next slide. You can even dig deeper and find out all this stuff. And I found out his parents' name. I never heard of Baum's Holler Road in this county. That must be in another part of the county. But they're buried in the Busby Cemetery, so that gives me another link to my family. Next slide. So you cross over Cooley Ford. I told Larry and Janine that one of my bucket list things was to put a canoe in here and go all the way down to the cabin. And we did that once. It was wonderful. And this is looking up the creek, and I'm always interested how the creek shifts from side to side and where the sand builds up. Next creek. Next slide. So we're going to turn off on Lewis Branch, and it's a beautiful drive. There's a huge field full of butterfly weed that should be blooming now or past that I notice now when I drive. Next slide. Drive through. There's other. And somebody taking beautiful care of this land, and they seem to have made it very family friendly and lots of things to do there. Next slide. Priestley Irwin was my grandfather's brother. I remember mostly his voice at church. He had a very squeaky, very unusual voice. "Francis, when did you get here?" I loved his voice. And his wife was a little tiny Kate, and they lived in a house that had been featured on the cover of some farm magazine because it backed up to the big bluffs, and he put little fences up there to make you think you could go up on the path, and it was very charming. You used to could go in on the road but now that's, whoever has it, it's closed, and you used to could drive off the hill down to it, and that's closed too, but it was on Frank Branch. So another location, next slide. The power lines are indicative. There's a great big swimming hole and bluff right over there under those that I've discovered in the last few years. Next slide. This is the Cook place. They had a bunch of children, and they were first cousins to my mother's family, so they were we always shared the family reunion. Stella, Della, Ora, and much more. So, next slide. On their property is where Lewis Branch crosses. Next slide. And right down there hits White Oak Creek. Next slide. So now you see Lewis Branch runs into White Oak, and you see Long Branch. And this is a spot that I go to. It's a public road, but you wouldn't even know it was a road. And it has beautiful bluffs, and I've discovered climbing hydrangea there. Hydrangea barbara. It's a native hydrangea that is blooming all over that bluff. And last September, I paid my little Yankee nephew to swim out there and get me a piece of it for $20. And he did. He actually did it. But I need to verify that it was truly climbing hydrangea, and it is. So it was fun to find that. So you see how Long Branch is, how long it is, and you see the cabins, and about the last thing here is, here's Irwin Place. You go across, Uncle Jimmy's place was up here, and you go, and right in here was Old Wynn Place. Next slide. So that's about as far up as the family goes. At the Irwin Place, I said we were artists. Or have I said that yet? On both sides, there's an art street. And this is Emily Schmidt's yard, and every time I have to stop and admire it. It's a landmark, and she has quite a sense of humor. It's right next to my grandparents' place. Next slide. This is my grandparents' Irwin wedding announcement, which is similar to my Askew grandparents' wedding announcement. They all say prominent young man of this place are, it's very positive. The marriage is a very positive experience, and they're very proud of it. So I was happy to find this announcement, 1904. That was the year my father was born. Next slide. His mother was Emily Haney Irwin, and his father was George Irwin. He died early, and she ended up having to run the house and all the children and sell off their land to survive. And this is a problem we have, not being able to read a lot of the markers. On a few of them that are really bad, I take a small roller, paint roller, put it in molasses, go over it, and then I spray paint, and then I wash it off, and you can read it for a while. And it doesn't seem to harm it. I've never used Clorox, so I don't. Next slide. We've got to repair this one. It's a really old one. That land in the Irwin family was deeded by when Andrew Johnson was the governor of Tennessee, and that's a copy of their deed. Next slide. 1854. Now here's the Irwin family. They're fun too. 11 children. Aunt Irene is missing. She's off at college. Here's my Aunt Lily and Uncle Hurley. Uncle Bruder, the story on Uncle Bruder, he's my granddaddy's brother, is as a young man he disappeared and was gone. We exaggerate too. They said 45 years. It was more like 20. But Uncle Bruder was gone for many years, not a word from him. And late at night, my grandfather's up banking the fire, about to go to bed, and there's a knock on the door. And he says, "Who is it?" and the voice says, "My name's James Henry, but you know me as Gruder." Well, he was back. Not a word to where he'd been or what he'd been up to, but he came back with a pack of about 30 hound dogs, and my grandmother's in the kitchen cooking for 10 children over a wood stove while Gruder is trying to mix up cornmeal mush for his dogs. So she had no wonderful feelings for Gruder. But all the children loved him because he did nothing but fox hunt and tell stories. And they said he had a fabulous memory where you'd say, "Uncle Gruder, what happened on June 7th, 1841? "Oh, yes," he'd say, "back in 1841, and come up with something. Well, they couldn't prove it. Right? And his mother said, what else did he have to remember? So he was a mess. Now you look at this and you think, oh, she's got to be tired and worn out. Uncle Jimmy she's pregnant with Uncle Jimmy. And that is the woman that came to help her deliver the baby, Aunt Ransom. So that was number 11, still there. Here they all grown up. Jimmy's arrived, his little boy, and Irene is a beautiful young woman. They also raised 2 orphan nephews, Herbert and Earl Haney, because my grandfather's mother was a Haney. And Herbert ended up going to World War I with friends and surviving, and they all settled in Oklahoma and were lifelong friends. And Herbert went to medical school and became a doctor. And he was married for several years. They had 1 child. The woman Larry was taking a picture of in front of the church. And when she was 5 years old, Evelyn, the mother, died from TB. And then 3 years later, Herbert died from TB. And he left it in his will for those friends from the war to take care of her, but she must go back to Houston County, to the Irwin family every summer so she wouldn't lose her roots. So that's why it was fun to travel around with her, because she was about the same age as my mother. And Mother adored Patty. And I think she liked Patty better than some of her girls at some points in time. But Patty could fill me in on all these. And she and Uncle Jimmy were great friends too. So after Uncle Howard, who was really smart and did well in school, Herbert got him a scholarship to a school in Oklahoma, and he became a doctor too. So he was a surgeon in Alabama. So at the family reunion, they just all couldn't wait to see each other. There were teachers, there were nurses, artists. They all loved to read. It was a really interesting group, and they loved politics. And one would always, usually Uncle D.H. would get on the other side if there was not an argument, just so they could continue the conversation. Next slide. So my grandfather, Grandfather Bill Irwin, also went to a school after high school, and I think it was Ruskin College, but I'm not sure. But he got together in reunion, and there he is. Next slide. So my mother was Frances Lillian Irwin Askew, and she was a teacher. In any other, if she'd been born 40 years later, she would have run a company or been in charge of something. But she was very modest and quiet and smart and kind. Next slide. And when she was a child, a couple from Vanderbilt came down and bought this property called Oakley, and their name was Osborne. And I'm not even sure I know the spell right, but they were a huge influence on the Irwin children. They had books that they shared with them. They taught the boys how to do stonework, and in turn, the Irwin family taught them how to stay alive in a rural community, you know, cook and grow vegetables and all that. Is it wild or is it tame? Next slide. So I'd love to know more about the Osmonds. They were fantastic. So you cross the creek in front of the Irwin Place, you cross Lewis Branch and you go up the hill. Next slide. So you're going up here, and Uncle Jimmy's place was, he called it, thank you, Billy Hill. And he worked on it for years so he could retire down here, and he came down and lived the rest of his life there and really loved it. And I spent a lot of years with him. So we're gonna go up to Long Branch and turn and go across the Ridge Road. Next slide. Anybody know Basso Gwen? That was the name that, good. And his sister was Lily and her daughter was Lee. Is that how it goes? And they always came to the family reunion too, and somehow I must be related to them. Next slide. So along the way, you see more beautiful flora, jewelweed, ironweed, and it changes by the week and the season, and I'm always looking out for it. Next slide. And then you get these beautiful vistas along the ridge road where you see Long Way and the hay fields and the grass fields are just beautiful. Next slide. And you come to Concord, which is the church and the place. Next slide. And I like how they just trim the verges and they leave the grasses growing on the edges. Next slide. And this is the bridge, and I don't know the name of it, but we always stopped at this bridge so Daddy could tell the story that up on this hillside there was a cabin where the Pettys lived. And I don't know if this is true or not.
That's
But he
true.
said, is it? Thank you.
Uncle Dude lived in the cabin.
Who did?
Dude Petty,
Okay.
he was a fox hunter.
Well, yeah, that's why Daddy knew him, I guess. So he said you walk up a little path and go to this cabin and look out over the creek. And it was a wonderful story, so I'm glad to know it's true. Next slide. So we're making our way along this place, and that's where I think the Pettys live, at that ridge. Next slide. More plants. This is the smooth leaf hydrangea that's on the bluffs around from that bridge. And this is a rudbeckia, and this is a frostweed. So lots of flora in Houston County. It's marvelous. Next slide. So my mother and Daddy get married. She has come back to teach, I think, at Griffin's Chapel. He's come back from Detroit where he spent 10 years. Daddy, one of my volunteers was the principal at Central High School in Memphis, and he brought me the book that had every graduate. And at that point, I discovered that Daddy was 22 years old when he got out of high school, which surprised me. He went on to Detroit and graduated from college, but he was very dyslexic. And when he was a small child, they made him switch from being left-handed to right-handed, and I don't think that helped. But Mother was the business manager in the family and handled the taxes and the books and all that, and Daddy was the friend at home. So they made a nice combination. Next slide. Here's their wedding day. Next slide. Here they are with their 4 girls. Daddy said he lived in the estrogen vortex. Mother said he couldn't have handled boys. Next slide. So here we are. And these are about the only pictures of us growing up, because somebody else took them. Next slide. So we are crossing White Oak Creek, and we always got excited when we saw that sign. We knew we were home, or we were going up home, as they said. Next slide. And now we're going across to the other side of Highway 13. And it seems to me that the gravel changes and everything changes over here a little bit. But it's still White Oak Creek Road, which makes it fun to do. Now, I've never been over here till September, and I decided for this presentation I really needed to see it. So Larry drove, and I got out my phone, and we found our way very easily all the way through it. And it was delightful. We drove 70 miles in one day, and so it was 40 something, about 35 each way. But it's a lovely Sunday drive, and I kind of miss those Sunday drives. And this made up for it. Next slide. Again, hay fields and woods. Next slide. This is actually Highway 231. Next slide. And now we're on the other side of White Oak Creek, and I was so excited. I wanted to see a mule, and I saw a parrot. So we're going all the way, we're trying to find the headwaters of White Oak Creek for some odd reason. I just felt like that would be important. So, next slide. Beautiful old house. Look at that great chimney. It's up on the hill. Next slide. This is Bignonia crossvine, another native. Next slide. This is a Culver's root. Look at that bloom. I love another native. Amelanchier canadensis, which has edible fruit. It tastes like vanilla blueberries. I have them growing, and I have 8 of them in my yard in Memphis. And this is another one whose name I can't remember. It's growing on the side of the road. Next slide. And we come to all the churches that mark the other side, just like it does this side. Next slide. Across the street from that one is the old church. Isn't that a wonderful old building? Next slide. Next to it is Mr. Collier has some land for sale. He's dead, I know, but his company lives on. Next slide. Another church. Notice by now the creek is dry. This is September 8th, and we haven't had rain for a while. Next slide. I love, this is probably 50 or 75 feet of the combination of grasses and yellow cannas. And it was so pretty and odd combination, but so I took a picture of it. Next slide. A lot of cattle farms, not a lot of cattle, most of them look like they were no longer in use. And then I love abandoned buildings, and I like quirky stone fireplaces. Next slide. These are all on that west side on White Oak Creek Road. We saw goats, more cemeteries, more dry creeks, and more chimneys. Next slide. There's the pair. I saw this gabion is when you use wire and put rocks in it. And I think this is all the old slag rocks. I don't know what about those, but I thought that's really pretty. Next slide. Turkeys. Some water in the creek here, and these big flat stones you see occasionally that are wonderful. You know, West Tennessee has no rocks, so we don't have natural occurring stones. Next slide. So we get to the top of where these creeks, where White Oak Creek sprang from, and it's you can drive all the way around it. And go next slide. So it's this area, and there are roads that allow you to, right here, go, we went this way, this way, this way down, to go all around where these springs are at the top of White Oak Creek. Next slide. And these are the ones that are the primary order that feed White Oak. Next slide. And this is what it looks like around. There are these beautiful grassy fields. It's on top of High Lookout. Next slide. So you can see in the distance. Next slide. And that property is for sale. And this is the description of it. Next slide. And look, a spring on the property. And that's one of the springs that feed White Oak Creek. So we were at the beginning. Next slide. More plants. This is Maple View Road down on Lower White Oak. This is called Anthophonaria, and it's also called Pussy Toes, and it grows in dry shade, full sun. And they're doing a lot of experiments with this plant. It shows great promise in medical. And it grows in colonies, and the seed aren't really viable. It grows by underground rhizomes. So if you're ever driving along that little road, stop and check it out. It's really pretty. Spigelia is another wonderful plants that I'm so thankful they don't mow the road so much here so the spigelia can grow along it. I've never seen so many in my life. It's up here on New Hope Road. It's just gorgeous. Next slide. This is my book. There are books about all sorts of things about native plants, but there was never a book of where to use them and why. And I was curious about that, so I got my state garden club and a lot of the women that are good at research together, and we started making lists of how to use native plants in the garden. And this is our inspiration. Margie Hunter wrote this one, Gardening with Native Plants in Tennessee, and she talks about all the native plants that are useful in the garden. She just doesn't tell you where to use them. So our book complements hers. If you don't have any books, buy this one. That one is the field guide to native plants that was done by the Tennessee Native Plant Society, and it's a wonderful resource. So in my book, no pictures, just lists. From my design work, people are always coming up to me. I feel like a doctor sometimes. My elbow hurts, but it's like, I have a fence, I want to grow an evergreen vine that blooms yellow. What do you suggest? And I'm thinking, do I look brilliant? I mean, I barely know what day it is. I just can't do this anymore, I'm thinking. So we wrote a book, so I said, buy the book. You can find it in there. So that has just about everything in it. And so this was a sketch I did to show you can actually have a planter with all natives in it that would be just as pretty as something that's not native. So, next slide. So, the other thing I'm curious about are the women in my family. This is mother and her sisters. And before that, what was Emily's mother's name? And what was George's mother's name? And that's lost in our research, and it's sad. And it's because these women insisted on being named Mrs. Sidney Summers, Mrs. Toon, Mrs. Andrew Cooksey, Mrs. Francis Askew. And I said, gosh, what is your name? I knew their husbands. I mean, thank goodness we now use our own names. We don't do that formality anymore. And maybe it'll make it easier for the next generation to find out who we are and trace us. Next slide. I found this picture recently of the Askew barn, and I couldn't figure it out until I got it on the computer and could enlarge it, and I figured out it's the same barn. That roof is that roof. Here's the road, and it's just taken from a different angle. My father was in Detroit, Michigan for 10 years. He went to a Jesuit college. He graduated, and he had 6 roommates there that were all from Detroit and Catholic. And they remained lifelong friends till each one died off. But one year, he invited Frank Crowley to come home with him. And in this scrapbook, there are always pictures of Daddy and Frank Crowley on the horse, at the creek, you know, just having a good old time. So I can't imagine what his impression was from going to Detroit, Michigan, but he must have loved it. And
What
every
road
year,
is that on, Susie? Do you know?
yes, this is, it's the road that is in front of the cabin, but it used to go straight through to the W.B. Summers Road, and it's now closed. And that road at the W.B. Summers Road where you go over the hill didn't exist for years. They put it in because of flooding. Next slide. So I'm sorry to say this is the only cabin the cabin picture I could find. There's a screen porch here, and it has an overhang with the front porch. And I have these cedar posts, and I have my blue bottles that get rid of evil spirits. And I've heard the saying that you die 3 times in your life. You die when your heart stops beating and your brain is dead. You die at your funeral when they speak words over you. And you die when people stop saying your name. And for many of our ancestors and relatives, especially the women, we've stopped saying their name because we know so little about them. We've stopped telling the stories. and they aren't relevant today, but really they are relevant and they're amusing. Next slide. So Uncle Jimmy, the youngest, and Mother, the youngest daughter, were great friends and big supporters of each other their whole life. Jimmy was an artist and a teacher. This is a piece of sculpture that he did out of the sandstone that came from Papa Askew's spring house down on Old White Oak Creek. Papa gave his daughter-in-law's baby brother that piece of sandstone to carve out of. And this is a painting that I got in his estate sale when he died, and it was taken from my cabin, but I had this picture, so I recreated it because I didn't want to give up the memory of that wonderful image. And mine doesn't look much like that, but it looks pretty good. Next slide. And this is a piece of sculpture that my Aunt Lillian did. Next slide. And this is the memory that we will always keep of a beautiful place that's influenced our lives forever. Next slide. So when you see a tree like this, when you're driving on Old John Bojock Road, you might think, I think the Indians did that. Or that's a message tree, but it's way too young. So who made that? Or how did that happen? Or when you see this bloom of a yellowwood, that's a native tree that nobody plants and everybody should, and you realize there's so many plants out there we should be learning about before they're gone. Or when you see a quilt that is a work of art made by human hands, you start appreciating the small things in life. Next slide. And I thank you for your attention.
Anybody have any questions about her slides or the program? Well, we thank you all for coming.
I have one question.
You have a question? Okay.
Are you related to Bill Irwin?
Yes,
You are?
first cousin.
Yeah, I know Bill.
Good.
Yeah.
You knew him. He's passed, hasn't he? Yeah. He's my, there were 22 Irwin cousins. And he was one of the older ones, but I knew him well.
Well, he was totally blind, but he walked the Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia with just his dog.
You want to hear what my mother had to say about that? She said no one as blind as he claimed to be could pour coffee as well as he did. That's what Mother said. And another thing, the ASPCA got after him several times, saying that was very cruel to the dog, and they made him stop and let rest to give the dog's paws a break. That wasn't mentioned in the book.
The dog was named Orient, let's don't forget.
Yeah.
Miss Suzy,
Uh-huh.
the crooked tree you had a picture there, Mr. George Miles was a county surveyor in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
He'd come survey for you for $15 a day, all day long.
Wow.
Going through the woods, through the line, he kept a hatchet. He'd hit a little small sapling like his thumb. It'd fall over. 30 and 40 and 50 years later, you go through the woods, that tree will be like that, but it'd still be laying over.
Yeah. Well, I've found information where someone said those kind of trees were signals in Native American culture, but that one couldn't be, it's too young. But I thought it was an interesting idea.
Susan, did you have a question?
I got a question. You mentioned McCaskill,
The McCaskills.
Turney, and
John Turney, McCaskill.
were any of them railroaders?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
They were on the Askew side of my family, but John Turney, the doctor, married my mother's niece, Virginia. So it crossed over there, but I don't know what they did, but.
Spell that their name.
McAskill.
A-S-K. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I think Daddy and John McCaskill were first or second cousins, but I don't know
Okay.
how.
My father worked for them.
Daddy, I think they're buried at the cemetery when you're going out of town. We take that little cutoff and there's a cemetery on the right side of the road. Daddy said, was his wife's name Hilda? Remember his wife's name? He said they moved dead more than they ever did alive. He moved them to 3 different cemeteries. But I think they ended up there. But they kept not liking where they were and taking them somewhere else.
Any more questions? We thank you very much.
Can we get a copy of that old picture of New Hope?
Oh, sure, yeah, you can. And is Eli's cousin here?
That's me.
Oh, okay, I wanted to say thank you to Eli, because that map's been hanging on my wall for years, and he saw it and said that,
It fascinated me.
yeah, good.
Oh, yeah.
And I can send, did he ever send you the file of it? He has it.
Yeah, he made me one.
Good, good. Well, I wondered if there's anything incorrect on it, because it was this little tiny print, and sometimes I get impatient.
I didn't find anything. Like I would know.
Yeah. Well, I didn't either, but I hope it's fairly accurate.
I mean, it seems that way to me.
Good.
I love it.
And I have some things for you. I did not know whenever I brought these things that they're all from your family.
Wow.
So,
And how did you get them?
my aunt, we're AGs.
This is Elias's cousin too.
Yeah. So Elias is on our mother's side, but our father, his mother was an AG.
Wow, how
So,
about that? Thank you.
that's from, and all of this stuff is from the Askews, from Hill Orchard Cemetery.
Yeah, good. I've got a big archive to give to the Hill Orchard stuff.
Any more
Thank you, I
questions?
appreciate it.
Thank you again for coming.